Thank you to Feud for sponsoring this video. Welcome to Feud, a newly released tabletop card game that pits two players against each other in a fight for valuable resources, the most of which being your leader's life points. Many of you watching this may actually recognize the designer of this game because he is a seasoned veteran in the Faeria community, the legendary Jokesy.
See the extra on the spot over there, it calls me.
And if you are familiar with the game of Faeria, you'll also recognize quite a few similar mechanics in Feud. Much of this game is about resource management. When we look at the playmats here, we can see that each player has 6 zones: the battlefield, the wall, the market, homestead, sacred grove, and the graveyard. The 4 zones in the middle here will give us some extra resources or bonuses whenever we have a unit placed inside that zone. So +1 silver for each unit in the market, +1 insight from the sacred grove, an extra card from the homestead, and 1 extra defense while holding the wall. Our leader is a very special kind of unit because this not only represents our life total and win condition for the opponent, but can exist in 2 different zones at once, placing them on one of these diamonds here. They also have a special passive ability to help speed up the game if it drags on too long. Each unit then has the chance to move to one adjacent zone if they wish each turn to change around which resources you're gaining. I love this kind of resource system because it creates this sort of investment each player has to commit to the board, where your regular combat creatures are doubling as your harvesters. But if you leave too many units harvesting, you're not going to have any defenders on the wall or attackers on the battlefield. So this balance of resources and offensive or defensive pieces is really tricky to master. The game mechanics overall here are simple and clean to learn, but very complicated to figure out the deep strategies for. And because we only get to move our units 1 space per turn, you may notice that any units harvesting this insight resource here are miles away from the battlefield. So you can probably imagine that this particular resource is pretty special. So let's take a look at the card drafting system to understand this. This game is not like your typical deck builder. You don't build a custom deck of cards and draw 1 each turn, but rather have access to a randomly assorted pool of cards that you can draft to the board each turn. These 12 cards here are selected at the start of the game and are open information to all players. Each player can draft up to 2 copies of these throughout the game. So if you are a fan of traditional deck builders but are sick and tired of the uneven randomness that can occur while drawing from a deck of cards, this system hits all those issues. You've probably noticed though that there are 2 decks of cards here that each player gets given. But these work the exact same way, aside from being hidden information. The knowledge and prophecy decks will be randomized, and each player gets given identical decks of cards. And when players have the opportunity to draw from these decks, they get to search through them for whichever card they wish. So it functions the same as choosing cards to draft from the draft pool, except your choices will be hidden from your opponent. Prophecy cards will get added to your hand when drawn, and knowledge cards will get placed face down in your sacred grove for future use. So how do we actually draw these cards? Well, the resource system in this game is actually super clean. We don't generate any resources naturally, like 3 Feria per turn, 1 mana per turn. It's all handled with the units you've placed on the board. And at the start of your turn, you first have an opportunity to move any units you like to adjacent zones. Then you'll collect any resources from these zones like silver or insight, which will all be tracked here. And the homestead is where you'll get to draw cards from. So for each unit in this zone, you get to draft 1 card, whether that be a unit, a prophecy card, or a knowledge card. Prophecy and knowledge cards go to your hand or the sacred grove as I mentioned, but you don't have to pay any additional costs until you're ready to actually activate these cards. Units on the other hand, well, you'll have to spend your other resources immediately in order to draft these. So there are 2 different costs to look at here: the silver cost and insight requirement. As expected, you'll have to spend this amount of silver, but insight is a threshold you have to reach, not a cost. If you're familiar with Faeria, this is the same as its land cost. So if I want to play the swordsman, I need to spend 1 draft point, I gain from the homestead, 3 silver, which is a cumulative resource, and then I'll need a minimum of 5 insight built up. I'll subtract 3 silver from my resources, but insight will remain untouched. Then I get to place this swordsman in any zone of my choosing except the battlefield. And this is where you can make some strategical decisions. Because remember, we have an opportunity at the start of each of our turns to move our units one space. So this means if we're unsure of which resources we might want next turn, we could place this swordsman somewhere where we have options for the next turn. The only way we can get to the battlefield next turn, though, is by placing him on the wall. So this creates a really clever way of describing summoning sickness that games like Magic the Gathering use, because the only way to actually attack your opponent in this game is by having units on the battlefield. So let's talk about this next stage in the turn order that comes directly after the resource phase: combat. This works similar to MTG combat if you're familiar with that, so you assign attackers and your opponent assigns blockers. You can only attack with units on the battlefield, but your opponent can choose to block with units that are on the battlefield or on the wall. And units on the wall take 1 less damage from all sources. Your hero has an added little bonus of being able to block up to 2 units. There's no retaliation in this game, so only the attackers will deal damage, and damage stays between rounds, unlike MTG. If any attackers are not blocked, you get to assign their damage to any unit on your opponent's board. So this is one of the main ways you can hunt down your opponent's hero if they're hiding away on the backline, but more commonly you'll probably want to take out your opponent's harvesters to starve them of resources. Much like Faeria, I can imagine this being a pretty snowbally game for this reason. I haven't played enough to confirm this, but small advantages you take in the early game are probably going to make for big swings in the late game if left unchecked. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I enjoy this type of game obviously since I'm coming from Faeria, but it is something to be aware of if you're not as big a fan of this game design. Since the game is mostly all open information, you will be brutally punished for making mistakes, such as leaving your wall undefended and losing precious early collectors. Though this is probably more relevant at a higher skill level. If you and your friend are just casual card game players, you probably won't notice as many unforgiving consequences like these. But this is the entire turn order. After combat, you'll resolve any other triggers and pass the turn, which is super clean. I love that this can all be stated in a tiny little 5-step graphic like this. Very simple core game design, but a super high skill ceiling in terms of decisions to make and strategies to invoke. Though I haven't yet discussed these sort of spell cards we have access to yet. When do we get to play our Prophecy and Knowledge cards? Well, they're not on the turn order because we actually get to play these at any point in the game, even during our opponent's turn. This is like all cards having instant speed if you're familiar with MTG. And also like MTG, we use the stack to determine multiple cards being played on top of each other. So anytime a player does something or plays a card, the other player has a chance to respond by playing one of their own cards or activate a unit's ability, which also happens at this instant speed. And this is where you actually have to spend your resources to play a Prophecy or Knowledge card. Prophecy cards are a one-time use and will be discarded after it resolves. Knowledge cards, when flipped face up from your Sacred Grove, will actually stay in this zone and provide a continuous and indefinite effect. And with this hidden information you have available, this is one of the main ways you can pull ahead over your opponent. There's a lot of mind games you can play, since both players are aware of which cards may have been chosen, but it still captures that gameplay that I love in other card games, where you get rewarded for playing around certain cards and taking certain risks if you can make a read on what may be lying in your opponent's hand. So, open information games are cool. They really do solve a lot of problems with RNG, but they do bring up some other issues which you may or may not be a fan of. Since this is a card game, you'll have a big advantage if you know what every card in the game does, so you can properly play around things and prepare for future cards that may be played. And both players have all of this information at their fingertips, but it's a lot to take in at first. So typically I think an average game lasts around 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the card pool you have access to and what strategies within those cards you choose to go for. But the very first game you play will probably take twice as long as this because of all the information you have to read on all the cards. There's a lot of different synergies in this game also, so obviously a player with more experience is going to be able to better recognize these synergies and play towards certain strategies. But since the card pool is different every game, players will have to spot these synergies on the fly, and I think this actually helps balance out players' skills, at least at a novice level. There's so much potential in which cards you choose to draft at the start of the game, which cards you combo with other cards, and there are multiple correct paths to go down each game. Then, just once you figured out a strategy you really like, the card pool completely changes during the next game, so you have new strategies to discover. If this game has piqued an interest in you, Joachim is running a Kickstarter campaign right now. Check the link in the description to support him over there, and grab this game for yourself. He has told me that if the Kickstarter fails, this game will not be available for purchase anywhere. It's all or nothing. And if you're on the fence about the game after this video, he has also made a tabletop simulator mod you can demo for free, assuming you own TTS. I'll leave links for this and also the Discord server down in the description if you're interested in those. Now, since this is a physical game, we should probably take a look at the quality here, see what it is you're actually buying. I don't normally review physical products like this on the channel, so I'm not going to pretend to be any sort of authority on the subject, but the cards seem like pretty good quality, a little thinner than standard TCG cards, but the other dimensions are the same, so if you really wanted to, these would fit into standard sleeves. The playmats are actually really good quality. This is like mousepad material, but it's a little thicker and heavier than most mousepads, so I can see these lasting a really long time. There's also a little display board you can set up cards in with their number codes if you want to spend the effort. Maybe you're playing several sessions of the game, nice little bonus. Do note that this game I have here is a prototype copy, but the real thing should look pretty similar. Aside from that, the card art is pretty minimalistic, but I like it. It has a very hand-drawn feeling to it, and I think it speaks to the passion behind the whole design and goals of this game. It's a dream of an indie game designer come to life, and the art design really shares that vision in a humbling way. I don't know, there's something about it that just gives me a feeling of comfort. Now, I know normally on this channel I only review and play digital card games, but let me know what you thought about this one down in the comments. It was definitely a unique experience for me, stepping away from my usual content, and I had a lot of fun doing so. Thanks again to Feud for sponsoring this video, and don't forget to check out their Kickstarter link down in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.